According to one of the earliest pirate chronicles, in 1718 the most feared pirate in the Caribbean sat in his cabin the night before his last battle, pouring himself a glass of rum. The story says he dropped black gunpowder into the drink, set it alight, and drank it. His name was Edward Teach. History remembers him as Blackbeard. He was not performing a trick. He was sending a message to his own crew, to the Royal Navy ship anchored half a mile away, to anyone watching from shore. The message was simple: I am not afraid to burn. The next morning, a British lieutenant named Robert Maynard boarded his sloop. Blackbeard toasted him with a glass of rum, then drew his cutlass and attacked. It took 5 gunshot wounds and over 20 sword cuts to bring him down. They cut off his head and hung it from the bowsprit. The rum was still on the table. For 400 years, rum has been tangled up with violence, with pirates, with empires, with slavery, with revolution. No other spirit on earth has that much blood on its hands. Whiskey built farms, gin built cities, rum built empires, and it did it with stolen land, stolen people, and stolen lives. But here is what nobody tells you. Rum was never supposed to exist. It began with a waste byproduct of sugar production, a thick black syrup that plantation owners often had little use for. The fact that someone looked at that syrup, fermented it, distilled it, and turned it into one of the most important commodities in the Atlantic world is one of the strangest accidents in the history of alcohol. If you are the kind of person who wants to know the real story behind what is in your glass, you are in the right place. Hit subscribe and turn on the bell. This channel uncovers the history behind every drink you have ever ordered. And this one has more bodies than a crime novel. This is the history of rum. Before we start, 3 questions. I am not answering them yet. First, the original name for rum was Kill Devil. It was a thick, clear, burning liquid so foul that plantation owners literally poured it into the Caribbean Sea. How did the worst drink ever made become one of the most valuable commodities on Earth? Second, in 1740, a British admiral mixed rum with water, sugar, and lime juice and forced his sailors to drink it every day. He had no idea, but he had just accidentally cured one of the deadliest diseases in naval history. The cure sat in front of sailors for decades before a single doctor figured out why it worked. Third, the most successful pirate of the Golden Age captured over 400 ships, more than Blackbeard, more than anyone. He refused to drink rum. He drank tea. 3 answers, all coming. But first, we need to talk about waste. In November 1493, Christopher Columbus loaded sugarcane cuttings onto his ships at the Canary Islands during his second voyage to the Americas. He planted them in Hispaniola. Within 20 years, sugar plantations were spreading across the Caribbean like fire. Sugar was enormously profitable, but the refining process had a problem. For roughly every 2 pounds of white crystallized sugar, the boiling cauldrons left behind about a pound of thick black syrup that refused to crystallize. Molasses, mountains of it, and nobody knew what to do with it. Planters fed some to livestock. They dumped the rest into the sea. Sometime in the 1640s, on the island of Barbados, someone decided to ferment the molasses. Then someone distilled it. What came out was clear, burning, and brutal. A visitor named Giles Sylvester described it in 1651 in what is the earliest known written record of rum. The chief fuddling they make in the island is rumbullion, alias Kill Devil, and this is made of sugar canes distilled, a hot, hellish, and terrible liquor. Kill Devil. That was the first name for rum, not because it killed the devil, because the drink was so harsh that people thought it could. Early rum was raw, unaged, somewhere between 60 and 75% alcohol, loaded with fusel oils and volatile compounds that burned your throat and your stomach, and probably a few other organs on the way down. The word rum itself likely comes from rumbullion, old Devonshire slang for a violent uproar or brawl. Honestly, a pretty accurate description of what happened to anyone who drank enough of it. But here is the thing about molasses. It was free. Sugar was expensive. Rum was practically worthless. And in the 17th century Atlantic, a cheap, potent spirit that did not spoil at sea was more valuable than gold. Within 50 years, rum stopped being waste. It became currency, and the trade it powered was the darkest chapter in the history of alcohol. The transatlantic slave trade operated on a triangle. 3 legs, 3 oceans, 3 currencies. On the first leg, ships loaded with rum, guns, and manufactured goods sailed from New England and Britain to the West African coast. At fortified trading posts along the Gold Coast and the Bight of Benin, European merchants exchanged their cargo for human beings. In the mid-18th century, an enslaved African man was traded for 200 to 220 gallons of rum, an enslaved woman for 180 to 190 gallons. That is a human life, measured in barrels. On the second leg, the Middle Passage, enslaved Africans were packed into the holds of wooden ships for a crossing that lasted 5 to 12 weeks. Of the 12.5 million people forced onto those ships, roughly 10.7 million survived the voyage. The rest died of disease, dehydration, and despair. On the third leg, the survivors were sold to sugar plantations across the Caribbean and Brazil. The plantations crushed cane, boiled juice, extracted sugar, and produced mountains of leftover molasses. That molasses was shipped back to New England, distilled into rum, loaded onto ships, and the triangle began again. A vast share of the enslaved Africans forced across the Atlantic were sent into plantation economies dominated by sugar, one of the most brutal and deadly sectors of the colonial system. The numbers from individual colonies tell the story more brutally than any summary can. Barbados imported over 600,000 enslaved Africans between 1640 and 1807. When slavery was abolished on the island in 1834, the total enslaved population was 83,000. Jamaica imported 1.2 million. At emancipation, 311,000 remained. The rest were dead, worked to death in cane fields, boiling houses, and distilleries. Sugar plantations ran 18 to 24 hours a day during harvest season. Exhausted workers fed cane stalks by hand into iron-crushing rollers. If a hand got caught, the rollers could not be stopped. Planters kept a hatchet chained beside the mill. If a worker was pulled in, someone would sever the arm before the body followed, and rum was part of the machinery of control. Planters gave daily rations of raw kill devil to enslaved field hands during harvest. It numbed pain, suppressed hunger, and dulled the will to resist. Extra rations were given to overseers and head drivers to create divisions among the enslaved, making collective rebellion harder to organize. Rum did not just witness the slave trade. Rum was the trade, the spirit that funded it, fueled it, and kept it turning for 200 years. And the people who drank it most freely were the ones who stole it. The Golden Age of Piracy ran from the 1650s to the 1730s. Port Royal in Jamaica, Tortuga off Haiti, Nassau in the Bahamas. The Caribbean was lawless, rum was cheap, and thousands of discharged privateers and naval deserters had ships, cannons, and nothing to lose. Pirates did not drink rum because it tasted good. They drank it because everything else spoiled. Fresh water turned green and foul within weeks at sea. Beer soured in tropical heat. Wine became vinegar. Rum survived. Mixed with water, it also gave sailors a more durable alternative to beer and helped make foul-tasting water easier to tolerate on long voyages. When pirates captured a merchant prize loaded with rum, discipline evaporated. Crews could drink without much restraint until the barrels ran dry. Blackbeard's own journal captures the cycle perfectly. Such a day, rum all out, our company somewhat sober, a damned confusion amongst us, rogues a-plotting, great talk of separation. So I looked sharp for a prize. Such a day took one, with a great deal of liquor on board, so kept the company hot, damned hot. Then all things went well again. Rum held pirate crews together, and rum tore them apart. In October 1720, the pirate Calico Jack Rackham and his entire male crew were anchored off Negril Point, Jamaica, drunk into a stupor after a heavy rum binge. A pirate hunter named Jonathan Barnett attacked their sloop. The only people who fought back were two women, Anne Bonny and Mary Reed, who fired pistols and swung cutlasses on deck while screaming at the men below to come up and fight. Nobody did. Rackham was captured, tried, and sentenced to hang. Before his execution, Anne Bonny visited him in his cell and delivered one of the coldest lines in pirate history. If you had fought like a man, you need not have been hanged like a dog. And the most successful pirate of the Golden Age? A man named Bartholomew Roberts, known as Blackbeard. He captured over 400 ships, more than Blackbeard, Rackham, and Henry Morgan combined. He terrorized the Atlantic from Newfoundland to West Africa. He drank tea. Roberts was a strict teetotaler who distrusted alcohol and wrote it into his cruise articles. Lights out at 8. If you wanted to keep drinking after that, you did it on the open deck. No exceptions. The deadliest pirate in history was stone cold sober, and nobody saw him coming. Pirates stole rum. The Royal Navy made it policy. In 1655, an English fleet commanded by Admiral William Penn captured Jamaica from Spain. Jamaica produced enormous quantities of cheap rum, and the standard naval ration of 1 gallon of beer per man per day was useless in the tropics because beer spoiled within days. Penn replaced the daily gallon of beer with half a pint of neat rum, roughly 10 ounces of spirit at 57% alcohol, issued every single day. For 85 years, British sailors drank that ration straight. The results were predictable. Drunken brawls, sailors falling from the rigging, disciplinary chaos, men too impaired to fight when enemy ships appeared on the horizon. In 1740, Vice Admiral Edward Vernon decided to fix the problem. He issued an order aboard HMS Burford in Port Royal, Jamaica. The half pint of rum would now be diluted with water and mixed on the open deck under the supervision of an officer. Sailors could add sugar and citrus when available to make the mixture more palatable. Vernon habitually wore a heavy boat cloak made of grogram, a coarse waterproof fabric woven from silk and wool. His sailors called him Old Grog. The watered-down rum became grog. And the word groggy, that sluggish, unsteady feeling you get after a bad night. It comes directly from the state of a sailor who had drunk too much of Vernon's mixture. But the citrus associated with grog pointed toward something far more important than reducing drunkenness. Citrus would later become one of the Royal Navy's most effective defenses against scurvy, a disease that killed enormous numbers of sailors. Scurvy destroyed collagen in the body. Gums bled. Teeth fell out. Old wounds reopened. Sailors died in agony. 7 years after Vernon's order, a Scottish naval surgeon named James Lind ran one of the earliest controlled clinical trials in medical history aboard HMS Salisbury in 1747, showing the remarkable effect of citrus fruit on scurvy. But it took until 1795 for the Admiralty to make daily lemon juice compulsory across the entire Royal Navy. Grog became the delivery vehicle. Decades later, in the 1860s, the Navy switched from expensive Mediterranean lemons to cheaper West Indian limes grown in British colonies. The limes had less vitamin C, but the nickname stuck. British sailors became known worldwide as limeys, not because they liked limes, because the Empire found them cheaper than lemons. A pirate's drink, diluted by an admiral in a funny coat, accidentally solved a medical crisis that had killed hundreds of thousands of men. Nobody planned it. Nobody understood it. The science came decades later. On October 21, 1805, Vice Admiral Horatio Nelson stood on the quarterdeck of HMS Victory during the Battle of Trafalgar. At 1:15 in the afternoon, a French marksman fired from the rigging of the Redoutable. The musket ball pierced Nelson's left shoulder, passed through his lung, and lodged in his spine. He died at 4:30. Nelson was Britain's greatest naval hero. The nation demanded a state funeral, but the voyage from Trafalgar to England would take weeks, and bodies decomposed fast in the Mediterranean heat. The ship's surgeon, William Beatty, placed Nelson's body in a large cask filled with French brandy, camphor, and myrrh. The spirit preserved the body during the long voyage home through storms and emergency repairs in Gibraltar. The legend that followed has never died. According to naval folklore, sailors drilled a hole in the bottom of the cask during the voyage, threaded tubes through it, and secretly siphoned out the brandy to drink. Beatty's official account tells a different story. The spirit level dropped because the wood in the body absorbed alcohol, and the cask was under armed guard day and night. But the Royal Navy never let the truth get in the way of a good drinking story. The phrase Nelson's blood became permanent naval slang for dark rum. Tapping the admiral became the expression for secretly siphoning alcohol from any barrel. And the sea shanty, a drop of Nelson's blood, was sung on Royal Navy ships for the next century and a half. The rum ration that preserved Nelson's legend would outlast the empire itself, but not forever. Before Americans drank whiskey, they drank rum. By the 1770s, the average American colonist consumed 3.7 gallons of distilled spirits per year. For adult men, the number was closer to 8 gallons. Most of it was rum. Over 140 distilleries operated in New England alone, converting Caribbean molasses into spirit. Distilling was the second largest manufacturing industry in the colonies, behind only shipbuilding. Rum was so woven into colonial life that a 26-year-old George Washington won his first election to the Virginia House of Burgesses in 1758 by distributing 160 gallons of alcohol to just 391 voters. 28 gallons of rum, 50 gallons of rum punch, and the rest in wine and beer. He won with 307 votes. Democracy. Colonial style. Britain knew how valuable molasses was to the colonies, and they taxed it. The Molasses Act of 1733 imposed a duty of 6 pence per gallon on all foreign molasses. The colonies ignored it. Smuggling was universal. Customs officers were bribed for a fraction of a penny per barrel. Then, in 1764, Prime Minister George Grenville passed the Sugar Act. He cut the tax in half, but sent Royal Navy warships to enforce it. Smuggling trials were moved out of local juries into military courts in Halifax, Nova Scotia. Customs agents were given sweeping search warrants. The colonial rum industry was under siege. The Sugar Act was the first British law designed specifically to raise revenue from the colonies, rather than regulate trade. It triggered the constitutional crisis that became no taxation without representation. Samuel Adams organized merchant boycotts. John Hancock's sloop Liberty was seized in Boston Harbor for smuggling untaxed Madeira wine, sparking riots that forced customs officials to flee. The molasses tax had lit the fuse. The explosion followed. John Adams wrote years later, "I know not why we should blush to confess that molasses was an essential ingredient in American independence." The Revolution came, and with it, the end of rum's reign. British naval blockades cut off Caribbean molasses imports. American distillers had no raw material, but they had grain, endless grain from the valleys west of the Appalachians. They switched from molasses to corn and rye and built something new. By 1810, the United States produced 15.7 million gallons of grain whiskey and only 2.8 million gallons of rum. Bourbon had replaced rum as the American spirit. The transition was permanent. Rum lost America, but it never lost the sea. On January 17th, 1920, the United States made alcohol illegal. Within months, a fleet of smuggling ships anchored just outside the 3-mile territorial limit off the coasts of Long Island, New Jersey, and Florida. They called it Rum Row. The most famous runner was a former boat builder from Florida named William Frederick McCoy. McCoy bought a 130-foot schooner, registered it under the British flag, and loaded it with genuine Caribbean rum, Irish whiskey, and French cognac. Unlike most bootleggers who cut their liquor with industrial chemicals, prune juice, or turpentine, McCoy never diluted or adulterated a single bottle. His goods were the real thing. The phrase, "the real McCoy," had existed since at least the 1850s, but Bill McCoy fit it so perfectly that his name became permanently welded to the expression. When you ordered McCoy's product, you knew exactly what you were getting. No poison, no shortcuts, just the real thing. But the real party was happening 90 miles south of Florida. While America went dry, Cuba became the drinking capital of the Western Hemisphere. Pan American Airways launched its first international flight from Key West to Havana in 1927, marketing the route with slogans like, "Fly with us to Havana and you can bathe in Bacardi rum in 90 minutes. Wealthy Americans, Hollywood actors, and mobsters flooded the island. And in the bars of Havana, 3 cocktails that would define rum for the next century were born or perfected. The daiquiri, often credited to an American mining engineer near Santiago de Cuba around 1898, who combined local white rum with lime and sugar, perfected during Prohibition by a bartender named Constante Ribalegua at El Floridita, who created the frozen version that Hemingway would drink by the dozen. The mojito, often traced back to an earlier Caribbean drink known as El Drake, later refined into the Cuban combination of light rum, lime, mint, sugar, and sparkling water. The Cuba Libre. Rum, Coca-Cola, and lime. Created around 1900 when a U.S. Army captain raised his glass and shouted, "Por Cuba Libre!" to a free Cuba, 3 drinks, 1 island, and a revolution that would scatter them across the world. In 1934, the same year Prohibition ended, a former bootlegger and world traveler named Ernest Raymond Beaumont Gant opened a tiny 24-seat bar in Hollywood. He covered the walls in bamboo, hung fishing nets from the ceiling, installed a tin roof that simulated tropical rainstorms, and served rum cocktails so complex that he wrote the recipes in numerical codes so his bartenders could not steal them. He legally changed his name to Don Beach. The bar was called Don the Beachcomber. Don Beach figured out something that nobody else in the American spirits industry had grasped. Rum was cheap, abundant, and varied wildly by island. Light Puerto Rican rum tasted completely different from funky Jamaican pot still rum, which tasted nothing like heavy Demerara rum from Guyana. By blending them together with fresh tropical juices, spices, and homemade syrups, Beach created cocktails that were layered, theatrical, and dangerously drinkable. His most famous invention was the zombie, created in 1934 to nurse a hungover customer through a business meeting. The customer came back days later and said the drink had turned him into a walking dead man for 3 straight days. Beach enforced a strict house rule, limit of 2 zombies per customer. The recipe was so potent, equivalent to 7.5 ounces of 80-proof spirit, that the rule was not a gimmick. It was a safety measure. Across the state in Oakland, a saloon owner named Victor Bergeron visited Beach's bar and went home inspired. He redecorated his spot with South Seas decor and renamed it Trader Vic's. In 1944, Bergeron created the Mai Tai for two Tahitian friends. Carrie Guild took a sip and said, "Mai Tai roa ae," Tahitian for out of this world. The name stuck. Tiki culture exploded in the 1950s and 60s. Millions of soldiers had returned from the Pacific Theater with memories of tropical islands. Hawaii became a state in 1959. Disney opened the enchanted Tiki Room in 1963. Suburban America fell in love with the fantasy of the South Seas. And then it collapsed. Disco, vodka, and industrial sour mix killed the craft. By the 80s, tiki bars were sticky tourist traps serving neon sugar and plastic coconuts. The recipes were lost. The art was forgotten until someone bothered to decode Don Beach's notebooks. In 2007, cocktail archaeologist Jeff Beachbum Berry published Sippin' Safari, cracking the numerical codes and resurrecting lost tiki recipes that had been buried for 70 years. The craft tiki revival had its Rosetta Stone. The Royal Navy had been giving its sailors rum every single day for 315 years. From 1655, when Admiral Penn captured Jamaica, through 2 world wars, through the end of the British Empire, through the dawn of the nuclear age. Every morning at 11, the bosun piped up spirits, and the daily ration was poured. But by the late 1960s, the House of Commons decided that high-proof alcohol was incompatible with modern naval warfare. Nuclear submarines, guided missile systems, radar arrays, and high-speed turbines required precision and sobriety. A tipsy sailor operating a nuclear reactor was not a tradition. It was a catastrophe waiting to happen. On July 31st, 1970, the Royal Navy poured its last tot of rum. They called it Black Tot Day. Sailors wore black armbands, black ribbons hung from their caps. Across the fleet, crews conducted mock funerals. Miniature wooden coffins containing tot glasses and empty rum bottles were carried across decks draped in black cloth. Buglers played The Last Post. Some sailors threw their final tot into the ocean. Others drank it in silence. 315 years of tradition, gone in a single morning. The rum tradition itself survived. In 1979, entrepreneur Charles Tobias founded Pusser's Rum, drawing on the Royal Navy's historic rum blend and donating royalties to a naval charity. And rum was entering a new age. In Barbados, producers such as Richard Seal at Foursquare helped push aged, unsweetened rum toward the premium end of the spirits world. In Jamaica, Joy Spence became the first female master blender in the history of the global spirits industry in 1997 at Appleton Estate. Mount Gay, operating from the same site since 1703, remained the oldest documented rum distillery in the world. The drink that started as toxic waste had become a collector's spirit. Auction houses sold single casks for thousands. The pirates would not have believed it. So what made pirates unstoppable? Not the rum. Not really. Rum did not make Blackbeard fearless. He was already fearless. He set his drink on fire because he wanted people to believe he was the devil. The rum was theater. Rum did not make Anne Bonny fight when every man on her ship surrendered. She fought because she refused to die a coward. Rum did not make Bartholomew Roberts capture 400 ships. He captured them stone cold sober while drinking tea. What made pirates unstoppable was the world that created them. An ocean full of stolen wealth. Empires built on sugar, molasses, and human trafficking. A global economy that ran on slave labor and cheap spirits. Pirates did not invent that system. They fed off it. Rum was the blood of that system. It paid for slaves. numbed the enslaved, fueled the sailors who policed the trade routes, and funded the revolution that broke the colonies free. No other drink in history has done that much damage or told that many stories. The next time you hold a glass of rum, you are holding 400 years of history. Pirates, empires, slave ships, revolutions, 2 world wars, and a funeral at sea for a 300-year tradition. Blackbeard's legend tied it to gunpowder. John Adams later wrote that molasses had been an essential ingredient in American independence, and the Royal Navy poured its last daily ration on a gray morning in 1970 while buglers played The Last Post. No other spirit has that resume. If the hidden stories behind what is in your glass are what brought you here, you already know what to do. Hit subscribe. Turn on the bell. I will see you in the next one. The drink we are covering next was accused of causing madness, blindness, and murder. Entire countries banned it for 100 years. Scientists eventually proved every accusation was a lie. By the time the truth came out, the damage was already done. They called it the Green Fairy. Until the next glass.